Okay, hi. I've already recorded this video like one time fully, but it was 48 minutes long, and there were parts of it that were distracting because I was sitting in a different corner and the light kept changing, so sometimes I looked like a skull because you could just see my eyes, and then the rest of me was in shadow, and it would just change all the time. It was very weird. So I'm re-recording this, but also the other one was so long. This one is going to be a lot shorter. So what you're going to do on your own is read chapters 14, 15. That is imagery and figures of speech is 14, and symbols and symbolism is 15. I'll put the page numbers down below the video. Quick announcement, you need to, when you get these videos, go to YouTube, watch them, but not only watch them, click on the see more, because under that is where your assignment is. So I'm getting emails from people which are leading me to believe that folks are not actually reading the instructions or following the instructions or listening to the instructions in the video. And I know the videos have been long, so I'm going to try to keep this one shorter, but I need you to do all those things, please. Okay, so a couple more announcements. This is our last week of poetry, and we need some intervention with regard to the essays that you've been writing, so I'm going to give you a separate writing instruction video that will be totally separate from fiction, poetry, or drama, because that needs to be its own video, because we need to look at essay structure. But as a preview, please go to your syllabus. The back page, I think the last page in the whole syllabus, has essay structure in it, on it. Your syllabus has essay structure. I know we did not spend a lot of time going over that in class, so that's why I'll make you a video, but please look at that structure. So as I'm grading your essays, and many of you have gotten them back, a few of you are still waiting, as I'm grading your essays and giving you feedback, for most folks, I'm saying you need to review essay structure. That's what I'm talking about. Go back to that and look at it, because you all need to have a thesis and then supporting points, and we need to talk more about that in a separate video. So today we're going to talk about imagery and symbolism and figures of speech, which is figurative language. So imagery is physically descriptive language used to paint a picture. This is really important because it helps us visualize what's going on in the poem. If you are speaking of only categories of things, for instance, cars or flowers or vegetables, that list I just said, we all have different reference points for vegetables, for cars, and for flowers in our head. But if you're writing a poem, or reading a poem, if you're writing a poem, it matters which specific things you choose to. Whoa, this is the first time I've ever sat like this since I broke my leg. Thanks for witnessing it. Okay, so if you're writing a poem, it matters how you choose to be specific about the language and the imagery. If you're reading a poem, it's your job to figure out what the author was doing when they were specific about those things and in the ways that they were specific about those things. So to link this back to the other things we've studied, the first week we looked at tone and theme. And tone is the author's attitude towards the subject or content of the poem, and then that kind of points us towards theme. Theme is the message or kind of the point. Last week we looked at language and word order. And so when we talk about language and word choice, we're talking about diction, how the author chooses words to convey the tone. So diction connects to tone connects to theme. All of these things work together to give us insight and entrance into the poem, and it's our job as readers to figure out how it works together. And so, of course, this week we're going to look at imagery and symbolism. An image often becomes a symbol. That's why I want to look at these two together. So a symbol, let's do parts of speech, not parts of speech, nouns and verbs. No, let's do figurative language. So for figurative language, I think your book covers metaphor. So metaphor is a comparison between two unlike things to reveal a deeper meaning or message, and it's implicit, meaning it is not explicitly stated. So if I say education is a mountain, you may understand from that education is hard and it takes perseverance to conquer it. That's what I mean by education is a mountain. If it were explicit, the comparison, it would be education is like a mountain, and that would be a symbol, a simile, or an allegory. I'm sorry, an analogy, simile or an analogy. An allegory would be like an extended metaphor, a metaphor that extends over the course of an entire story. So these are figurative ways of expressing deeper meaning and message and theme, really, through language. It's kind of hot in here. What else? Personification. Personification is when you take, when you give something inanimate, something that is not living, qualities of a person. So the book was sad because no one had read it. A book cannot be sad or happy, but we are conveying that no one has touched the book or read the book, and we are assigning personal and personal reactions and personhood reactions to that book. Didn't quite say that right, but I think you know what I mean. And after that, we've got simile and analogy, which we already went over, and then allusion. Allusion is when you are making a reference to something outside of the world of what you're talking about, or not necessarily outside of the world, but it's if I'm writing a poem, and I'm not writing about a historical happening, but I want to make a reference to that historical happening to prove my point, that would be a historical allusion. There are also artistic allusions. There are allusions to other pieces of famous literature. A lot of times you'll see biblical allusions, so some reference or a piece may reference or point to something from the Bible. So those are what your book is calling figures of speech, but what I am calling figurative language. I guess they're the same thing, but figures of speech are usually something a little more specific, like idioms or sayings. So maxims, it's a little strange that they're calling like a metaphor a figure of speech. But anyway, that doesn't matter. That's just semantics. Okay, so to look at imagery and images and how images turn to symbolism and then metaphor and so on and so forth, we're going to look at 5 different books. So let's get to it, because I have to leave right now, which I'm not going to do. So, but we still have to be fast. Okay, so this is by Kaveh Akbar from his book, Calling a Wolf a Wolf. Please buy this book, it's amazing. This is called Orchids Are Sprouting from the Floorboards. Orchids are sprouting from the floorboards. Orchids are gushing out from the faucets. The cat mews orchids from his mouth. His whiskers are also orchids. The grass is sprouting orchids. It is becoming mostly orchids. The trees are filled with orchids. The tire swing is twirling with orchids. The sunlight on the wet cement is a white orchid. The car's tires leave a trail of orchids. A bouquet of orchids lifts from its tailpipe. Teenagers are texting each other pictures of orchids on their phones, which are also orchids. Old men and orchid penny loafers furiously trade orchids. Mothers fill bottles with warm orchids to feed their infants who are orchids themselves. Their coos are a kind of orchid. The clouds are all orchids. They are raining orchids. The walls are all orchids. The teapot is an orchid. The blank easel is an orchid. And this cold is an orchid. Oh, Lydia, we miss you terribly. Okay, so there's a tremendous amount of really detailed physical descriptions, right? Some very descriptive imagery in there that's very specific, but there's a repetition of one specific image that becomes a symbol, and that is orchid. So the orchid becomes a symbol of many different things. The key to what the orchid might mean is that last line, oh Lydia, we miss you terribly. And that, of course, connects us to this idea of loss and possibly death, which also, and connected to flowers, which connects us to rituals that many different cultures have had throughout many different ages, connecting flowers and death and rituals of mourning and grief. And so this poem, which is just a repetition of beautiful imagery, is also so much more. And it all rests on that last line, but also it rests on the specific imagery. So it matters a lot that we have sounds that turn into orchids and also concrete images that turn into orchids, things that are one thing that turn into another thing, right? Which is how grief works too. You know, your love can turn to grief when you've been betrayed or left, right? And maybe it doesn't turn to it, maybe they coexist. And that's kind of what I feel like this poem is doing with the orchid image, and how the orchid image really does pop up into every other image, as also mourning does. When you are grieving and mourning, it's everywhere. Everything you look at or see becomes that grieving and mourning. And that's a really interesting, it's an interesting phenomenon. It's a hard phenomenon, but it's pretty incredible that Kaveh Akbar, through the use of imagery and symbolism, is able to replicate that human psychological process in a poem. It's amazing. So at the end, we have the walls are orchids, the teapot is an orchid. So we were in the outside world, and in the general world, we've got teenagers, old men, babies. These are other people's teenagers, old men, and babies. You know, they're not specific necessarily to the speaker, but then we're in a room because the walls are orchids. The teapot is an orchid, so we're getting more specific. The blank easel is an orchid. Okay, why a blank easel? An easel is something that holds a canvas, and so this easel seems to have neither canvas, or if it does have a canvas, there's nothing on the canvas. And so it's an easel sitting there. An easel is meant to carry something and hold something, and this easel is not, which is an interesting image in itself. And this cold is an orchid. So something is cold. Is that a physical cold, or is that an emotional cold? What is it? Oh, Lydia, we miss you terribly. Okay, so this is a great example of a poem. This is what it looks like, by the way, that brings together images and symbolism through the imagery, and repetition and a whole bunch of other things, because Kaveh Akbar is amazing. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to try to stop fidgeting. I'm really bad at not fidgeting. Okay, this poem is a very funny use of, oh shoot, I wanted to check something before I read this poem. Give me 2 seconds. Okay, sorry, I try to remember to check everyone's pronouns before I read you their work and then talk about them, because I don't want to misgender anybody. So I wanted to make sure. I don't know Sarah Galvin very well. I mean, I don't know her personally at all, but I know only this book of her work, and I wanted to make sure that she uses her pronouns, which she does. Okay, so this is called Midday Cowboy by Sarah Galvin. When I discovered the ever-anticipated kegger with fireworks was a birthday party for the only person who has ever betrayed me, I thought, if I were a cowboy, I'd just shoot him. I wished and wished I was a cowboy. But then I noticed someone across the street had put a sign in the window of their apartment that said, "Life is good." So I went to QFC and had them make me a cake that said, "Happy birthday, Sarah Galvin." And I took all my clothes off and lay on top of it yelling, "Yeehaw!" until I was arrested. All right, I think this poem is just such a delight, and it uses imagery and symbolism. I think the cowboy is really our symbol here, although maybe you have a different idea. But I love it. I love it, especially in contrast to the poem I just read by Kaveh Akbar. Such different writers, such equally delightful writers, right? Okay, so I also there's a logic in this poem that is just so funny to me. This author writes, she's just a very funny writer, but she also is just quirky and strange and imaginative, and everything to me is always a surprise in all of her work. So the idea that there's this ever-anticipated kegger, so everyone's anticipating this kegger, like it seems like in her whole community, or maybe in the whole world, forever and always, this kegger has been anticipated, and she finds out, what just happened? Oh, good. I'm so sorry. It's not even worth explaining to you what happened, but something happened on my computer and I thought I stopped the whole video. But I don't know what I did. But I know we're still going, so sorry. Okay, so everyone's anticipating this kegger, and it turns out it's a birthday party for a person she doesn't like, but there's a reason. This person, who is a he, has betrayed her. But not only has he betrayed her, he is the only person who's ever betrayed her. And so when we talk about word choice and language, it matters tremendously that Sarah Galvin's only betrayer is having a birthday party, and it's not a line of people who have betrayed her. It's not a group of people. It's not like there's multiple just shitty people in the world and you can toss it up to that. No, this is the person, like her enemy, the only person who's ever betrayed her. So it's really important that she chooses to use the word only. Only and ever are two small words that don't seem to carry a lot or do a lot of work, but in this poem, they do a tremendous amount of work because they position us to, as a reader, to sympathize with the writer and to understand who this evil villain is, right? So then, when she finds this out, she wished she was a cowboy because, obviously, here's where the funny logic comes in. If she were a cowboy, she'd just shoot him. She's not concerned for the law, right? Like, if I had the identity of a cowboy, I would just shoot him and that would be totally normal. And I love the little joke there, right? Because cowboys aren't born cowboys, they become cowboys. But Sarah Galvin here is almost saying like it's an identity that cannot be altered and that she wished and wished she was a cowboy. I love that part too. It's just so ridiculous. But she's not a cowboy, so instead she has a cake made for her. So remember, it's her betrayer, her enemy's birthday. She has a birthday cake made for her. And when I say her, I mean the writer, because in the poem she references herself. It says, "Happy birthday, Sarah Galvin." And then she takes off all her clothes, sits on or lies on the cake. She lay on top of the cake and yells, "Yeehaw." And so instead of becoming a cowboy who shoots people, she becomes a cowboy who lies naked on a cake until she gets arrested, yelling "Yeehaw." And the symbol of cowboy as the vigilante, as the rebellious person, as the free person, is really powerful in this little story poem that Sarah Galvin and the world she's created. But it's interesting too because the cowboy, she's not a cowboy, but then when she tries to become a cowboy, she just does a totally ridiculous thing. And so I wonder if Sarah Galvin is pointing at the history of cowboys in our country or masculinity and sort of the silliness of some toxicity around that. Like that may be a reach, but maybe that is what she's saying. I'm not sure, especially because her enemy in this poem is a man. So I don't know. I just think it's interesting, and I think the way that the image of the cowboy becomes a symbol and changes throughout the poem is just very funny and also really interesting and really clever. I also think it'd be fascinating to write an essay on this poem looking at every single image, every single concrete thing, and trying to decide what it means and why it's in the poem. Like, what does the cake symbolize, for instance? Okay, so that's Sarah Galvin. Here we have another bizarre writer who uses imagery in a really strange and delightful way. This is, oh no, I've lost my place. No, I haven't. This is called The Mustache by Sabrina Ora Mark. The mustache. Everything about the young foreign taxidermist was overdone. Did he absolutely have to wear the apron with the tiny red castles in the shop? Or weave at night in and out of trees? I don't think so. I would bring him buckets of ice water day after day, hoping he would just cool off a bit. Fact is, he never did. But to be fair, he really was practicing what the papers called heroic medicine. It was love, I admit it. It was fancy love. I was the envy of the world, being hitched up with such a genius, and that felt good. Of course, these days I can't touch rope or a small child without thinking of him, without expecting his large hands to come out of nowhere. We were, as my mother said, both slowly losing our minds. He'd talk for hours about hygiene, the water cure, for example, and wrote an award-winning essay on the electric bath as a way to treat hysteria in the female fox. Too many foxes, he would say, shaking his fist. Too many foxes running about like chickens with their head cut off. In the winter months, we would ride our bicycles down to the scrap metal yard, where he would make love to me in devout silence. the delight in his eyes when he found the small cage. He was both tender and rough, and I had never and will never again be as touched by another man. I didn't notice the black mustache growing slowly but unmercifully on his left shoulder till 2 or 3 years into the affair. At first it seemed harmless, a small patch of dead grass, but eventually I couldn't help but only see the large dark field, its silent twitching. By then, it was already early fall, and the fact is, it tore us apart. Alright, I gotta find my cord and plug in my computer because it's about to die. This is also another thing I haven't really ever been able to do with my leg. Oh no, reach, please don't die. Hold on, I'm coming. Oh my gosh, we're down to the wire. Oh, we made it. Did we make it? Are you charging? Come on. Come back to life. This is so annoying. Computer won't hold charge. My charger won't charge. There are worse problems in the world, I know, but gotta be kidding me. Okay, well, we are going to move this video into a different room with a different charger. What else do we have to read? We've only got 2 more poems, so we're almost done anyway. Give me 1 second. Don't die, computer. Okay, so, charger that works, where are you? Oh my gosh. Phew. That was very scary. Okay. Sorry that this is my bedroom now. Welcome. Okay, so I want to look at really quickly. Oh no, we didn't talk about Sabrina or Mark. Okay, Sabrina or Mark, and I left the poem in the other room, but what I think is really interesting about that poem and really fun and tragic is that the title of the poem, The Mustache, is also sort of what the poem is, well, what the symbol is, right? So the mustache is sort of the symbol of the poem, but we don't really learn about the mustache until the last, I don't know, 1/8 of the poem. The very, very end. So we have all this exposition, all this kind of building of the characters, both the speaker and this young taxidermist, which is an interesting symbol in itself and choice because a taxidermist is someone who preserves dead animals. So if you've ever seen, you know, a deer on a wall, that is the work of a taxidermist. And so I would imagine it's a difficult thing to do. It's probably also a kind of art, and also it probably takes a certain kind of person to be able to preserve dead things, you know. And so it's interesting that this person that she is talking about is a taxidermist. Like, she could have chosen any profession, but that's what she chose. And at the end, it's really a story of falling out of love, it sounds like. So it was love, I'll admit it, fancy love, she says in the poem. And then she quotes her mother and says, we were both slowly losing our minds. And so she and the taxidermist are both going mad. And perhaps from their love, or perhaps individually, whatever the case is, they grow apart. But the symbol of them growing apart is this thing she didn't notice at first that then she notices, and then is all she can notice, and it's the mustache, which is not on his upper lip but on his left shoulder. And so there's so many things to unpack there as far as a symbol. You know, mustache is hair, but the fact that it's hair that's out of place on a body. You know, it's one of the most normal things. Everyone's body has hair. But this idea of being in a partnership that's intimate and loving the person in a fancy way, fancy love, but then falling out of love with them as you slowly realize these small physical details about them that you didn't notice at first and now you can't stand. Maybe the way they chew, maybe, you know, small things, right, that don't matter and that are very daily and normal and not out of the ordinary, and yet Sabrina or Mark changes it just enough where it is this surreal event where there's a mustache growing in his shoulder that is small at first, but then she just notices it as like a dark field, and the movement and twitching of it, and it tore them apart. It came between them. So the stories she's telling there, there's multiple stories she's telling there, and we got to move on from her, but I just think it's fascinating, and I think we have 3 examples of 3 different ways to use image and symbolism, and in Kava's, you know, the image of the orchid is used throughout, and we realize it becomes symbolic as we move through the poem. In Sarah Galvin, the cowboy is introduced, I think, in maybe the 4th line, and the cowboy is the humor and is also the moral and is also the joke, and is also the thing that really reveals the character of the speaker. And then in Sabrina or Mark, the mustache is at the very end of the poem, and reveals everything. It becomes the vehicle that reveals the point of the poem, why we're reading about this, really, because we're reading about the dissolution of a love affair, in a way, which a lot of her work is about. And it's interesting because she articulates it in ways that seem more true to me than other more accessible breakup poems. So Sabrina or Mark, if you're watching, which I know you're not, love it. Okay, let's look at Giovanni Singleton. So I think I need 2 hands for this. So I'm just trying to like figure out the best way to keep this plugged in and to keep, okay, there. So Giovanni Singleton wrote this book called American Letters, Works on Paper, and she uses like actual images, not just word imagery, but like actual images throughout the poem, and I mean the poems in the book, and it's fascinating the way she uses this. And I want to show you 2 pieces that are small and not at all simple. Okay, so what we have here is an equation. Black and white equals black and white. I'm sorry, black plus white equals black and white. Things are not as they seem, nor are they otherwise. Lankavatara Sutra. And this is called numbers. I mean, there's so many things going on here. First of all, as you might have noticed, the word black is abbreviated. The word white is not. The equation, the plus and the equal sign are bold. But then on the other side of the equal sign, we don't have the combination of black and white. We have rather black and white, right? So when you add 2 numbers together, they combine to make a greater number. And what Giovanni Singleton is saying here is that, or one of the things Giovanni Singleton is saying, many things here, one of the things she's saying is that black plus white in America does not equal something greater. It equals still black and white, the separation. So I don't know. So the equation doesn't balance and it doesn't work. And when you think of the word equation and an equal sign, another thing she's saying here is that black and white are not equal in this country, which we know is very true from both history and our present existence, even as we look at COVID-19 and what communities are getting help and what communities are suffering greatly. We see those inequalities bear out all the time. And so she has found a way to symbolize that, you know, really math is its own language of symbols, and she uses that in a really powerful way to show this. But then underneath it, she has this this line: things are not as they seem, nor as they are they otherwise. So they're not what they seem like, and they're not what they seem like, or they're not other than what they seem like, which is something that it would take a very long time to unpack. And then she calls this numbers, which can mean a lot of different things. This was obviously written before COVID-19, but when I think of numbers, I think of numbers of deaths or survivors. Think of numbers as a book in the Bible, which was, I think, just like accounting for different family. Never mind. I don't know what numbers was, so pause on that description. Yeah, but there's a lot there, and there's a lot to unpack, so please pursue more Giovanni Singleton. I would, if we were still meeting in person, I would have brought this in. The other one I want to show you is this. Sorry, can you see that? All right, so once again, using a physical image that becomes a symbol of, in this case, I would say a symbol of hypocrisy or lies or conflict. So we have what looks like a pyramid, a three-sided pyramid, but the pyramid shape is made up of the words, "The world is round," repeated over and over and over and over and over again. So it's a little bit of a trick because our brains, our eyes see this pyramid, but the words are telling us that the world is round. And so if the world is round, then what is this pyramid? Is the pyramid not part of the world? Is the pyramid outside of the world? What does that mean? Is the pyramid the world, and yet we're being lied to? I think all of these are possibilities of this piece. But then we have a comma and the words "ain't it" in the base or the smaller triangle. And that's fascinating. So the world is round, the world is round, the world is round, the world is round, ain't it? And there's no question mark there, but it's fascinating because the "ain't it" both points to the fact that no, it's not. I mean, the physical world isn't like perfectly round, but also, although it's definitely round, I'm not saying the earth is flat. The world is round. But when we're told something is one way, as we're being presented a different truth with our eyes, we're basically being told not to listen to ourselves. And I think that's what one of the things she may be pointing to. In the same way that first one I showed you, black plus white should equal a combination of the two, but it equals the two still separate. We may be told that there is equality while witnessing that there isn't. And that is one of the ways that oppression perpetuates itself, and that we people perpetuate oppression by participating in those lies. And so I think what Giovanni Singleton does throughout this whole book, whether she's using kind of an image poem with the shape on the page, like a visual image in addition to just imagery with words, because she has all different kinds of poems in here, she's always pointing to these conflicts, these tensions, these sort of inequalities and inequities, and she does it really beautifully through image. So yeah. All right, the final poem I'm going to read you is by Ilya Kaminsky, and I'm going to read this poem, and your assignment is going to be, and I'm going to write it out below, but your assignment is going to be to look at this poem for all the things we've looked at so far. So that would be tone and theme, language and word order and word choice, diction, and then of course imagery and symbolism. And I'm not going to give any kind of analysis after the poem. There's also two more poems that are very, very, very famous, like more famous than anything else we've read, that I was going to put in here in my discussion, but instead I'll attach them below along with some analysis of them. And that is The Anecdote of the Jar and The Red Wheelbarrow. And I will put everything you need to know about those below. But they are very strong image and symbol-based poems. All right, so our final poem, Dancing in Odessa by Ilya Kaminsky. Dancing in Odessa. We lived north of the future. Days opened letters with a child's signature, a raspberry, a page of sky. My grandmother threw tomatoes from her balcony. She pulled imagination like a blanket over my head. I painted my mother's face. She understood loneliness, hid the dead in the earth like partisans. The night undressed us. I counted its pulse. My mother danced. She filled the past with peaches, casseroles. At this, my doctor laughed. His granddaughter touched my eyelid. I kissed the back of her knee. The city trembled, a ghost ship setting sail, and my classmate invented 20 names for Jew. He was an angel. He had no name. We wrestled, yes. My grandfather fought the German tanks on tractors. I kept a suitcase full of Brodsky's poems. The city trembled, a ghost ship setting sail. At night, I woke to whisper, yes, we lived. We lived, yes. Don't say it was a dream. At the local factory, my father took a handful of snow, put it in my mouth. The son began a routine narration, whitening their bodies, mother, father, dancing, moving as the darkness spoke behind them. It was April. The sun washed the balconies. April. I retell the story, the little etches into my hand. Little book, go to the city without me. Sorry, I misread the last 2 lines. I retell the story, the light etches into my hand. Little book, go to the city without me. All right, so this has a lot of different things in it. It has got some simile, some metaphor. It's got, as I was reading it to you, I just counted 2 allusions, one historical, one biblical, but I'm sure there are other ones that I didn't catch. And it certainly has imagery and symbolism, and imagery or images that become symbols. And so, yeah, I want you to do a deep reading of that. I will post it below along with a written out assignment, so you don't have to just rely on this verbal assignment. Sorry for all of the mishaps and the fact that we almost got cut off and the fact that I thought we were cut off. But I also am proud to say that this is only 37 minutes and not 48. Bye.